Straw for the House. A retelling of the Japanese folktale Warashibe Chouja by PJ Leonard. Part 4. Tina didn't see the car for the next few days. Alfonso and his agent had requested that they have the car for the few days before the derby, to get it race ready, the agent had explained. And so, Tina wandered listlessly around the house, doing little tasks like doing the laundry, cleaning the oven, and pulling weeds out from the cracks in the patio. What now? The house on the hill was gone, and that bizarre string of trades had also ended. She looked around the house. There were no books she hadn't read, no movies or TV shows she hadn't watched. Nothing. Was her life really so empty? She slumped onto the sofa, flicked through the TV channels, and then switched it off. She looked out of the window. The sun had sunk behind the lines of houses opposite. She felt suddenly exhausted, all energy pulled from her. She clambered back out of the sofa and climbed slowly up the stairs to bed. As Tina walked to work the next day, fighting through the sheets of drizzle with an umbrella, she began to exercise the possibility that Alfonso had lied to her. She hadn't heard a thing from him or the agent since they'd departed from the petrol station, despite the fact that she had given them her phone number. How had she come to trust a stranger she'd met merely seconds before so quickly? How could she be so gullible? For all she knew, they could have been two con artists, hustling the streets and tricking people just like her. She imagined Alfonso and the agent laughing as they drove away, making their way to their secret garage filled with stolen cars. Tina tapped aimlessly away at her computer, reading but not really reading through the backlog in her emails. She wasn't that angry, really. She'd only had that car for all of 15 minutes, and she'd only got it through the accidental trading that started with a single blade of straw. But at least that had distracted her from the truth for a while, that she'd lost her dream house, and she had nothing else in her life to fill it with. "Tina?" Tina wheeled around. It was the boss, Mrs. Wilkins. Yes," said Tina, a little too loudly. Mrs. Wilkins sat down next to her. She had a round, friendly face, framed by curly locks, but now it was scrunched up in concern. "Are you feeling okay?" she said. "Me? Oh, I'm good," said Tina, wondering why on earth her voice was so high. "Yeah, I was just... What makes you think there's a problem, ma'am?" "Because you haven't moved for 3 hours," said Mrs. Wilkins. Tina looked blearily up at the clock. How had it become lunchtime so quickly? "And since when have you started calling me Mom?" Tina let out a long sigh, feeling like a deflated balloon. "It was a strange day off, Dawn," said Tina. "Evidently," said Mrs. Wilkins, "and I think you might need another one." Tina raised an eyebrow. Mrs. Wilkins leaned in closer, wearing a pitying smile. Tina blushed. Was she really so obvious? "You've been the hardest working employee here for years, Tina," Mrs. Wilkins murmured. "You remind me of a younger me, and that's what worries me." "Oh," said Tina, forcing herself not to roll her eyes. How many times had she heard this story? "No, it's not like—" But Mrs. Wilkins held up a hand. "Don't burn yourself out," she went on. "Stop and take a look around now and then. You've finally taken a day off, and you're finally starting to see what you're missing. That's what I think. Look, if you want, take the rest of the day off. Take the whole week off. You've earned it." Tina said nothing. Mrs. Wilkins smiled, sadly. "I see. Well, come and see me if you change your mind." And Mrs. Wilkins walked away. Tina's phone buzzed, and she picked it up. It was a message from Alfonso's agent. "First place, prize is yours. Meet us at the petrol station where we first met at 6 p.m. Tina launched from her seat, heart pounding as if she'd had life shocked back into her. She spun around and chased after Mrs. Wilkins. "I think I'll take you up on that offer after all, Dawn," said Tina. Tina leaned against the wall by the car wash, watching the seconds tick by on the big clock above the petrol pumps. 5:58 p.m. She drummed her fingernails on the concrete. What if this was another trick? She imagined Alfonso and the agent whistling by in the car any moment now, pointing and laughing at her. She shivered. Well, at least she'd be sure then. The car appeared at the corner of the junction. Tina gave a jolt, as if she'd just been snuck up on. The car veered around the corner, the engine growling. But it didn't speed away. It pulled into the petrol station and right up to her. The agent and Alfonso stepped out, equally wide grins on their faces. Alfonso clasped his hands together and shouted to the high roof of the petrol station. "He did it," said the agent. "First place. Made it look easy. I haven't seen him race that well in years. And it's all thanks to you." The agent tossed something to Tina. It glinted as it caught the light. A key. For one wild moment, Tina thought she was being given the car back. But the moment she caught it, she could feel it was a different key. Older. Heavier. "What's this for?" she said. "For the prize," said the agent. "The address is engraved on the keychain. It's not too far from here." That didn't really answer her question, but she nodded and pocketed it. Alfonso gathered Tina into a hug. "Grazie," he said. "Mucho grazie, signora." He did that strange air kissing across each of Tina's shoulders as she stood there awkwardly. You're welcome," she said, well aware of how red her ears must be burning right now. After a handshake from the agent that felt as though her knuckles were being pressed between two rocks, he and Alfonso were back in the car. Tina watched it disappear around the corner again, and she listened to the roar of the engine fade away to echoes. She clasped the key in her pocket. The sun was already beginning to set. It's not too far from here. She strode out of the petrol station towards her house. Well then, she thought, no time to waste. 20 minutes later, she was in her own little car, driving around the outskirts of town. The winding road snaked its way up the side of the mountain that loomed over the town below. More than once, she looked down at the houses shrinking away below her. Everything looked so small. But the house on the hill stood out as clear as ever, a green bump topped with the tiny toy house. She forced her eyes away and back on the map on her phone. Not much further now. But what could possibly be up here that would be the first prize from a vintage car derby? Unless Alfonso and the agent really had tricked her, sending her halfway up a mountain to get a head start stealing her car. She clasped the steering wheel. No. Stop thinking the worst in people, Tina. You'll see. She rounded the corner and nearly planted the car into the rock face at the site. A vast mansion towered over her, carved into the side of the mountain. Countless windows flashed the reflected sunlight back at her. Vines twisted around the iron gate, which had to have been twice as tall as her, and it was slightly ajar. She pulled up the car and stepped out, neck craning up at the maze of brickwork. She frowned. What next? She checked the keychain. Yes, the address matched the one embossed on the golden postbox nearby. But what was the prize she was supposed to collect from here? Perhaps the owner of the house would know. She slipped through the opening in the gate and walked through the gardens. The garden was perfectly symmetrical, with a fountain in the centre, though it was switched off. The more Tina looked around, the more she noticed the parts of the garden that were overgrown, weeds twisting out of the rose bushes here and there. She clambered up the vast stone steps, lifted the iron knocker on the door, and slammed it down. She heard the boom echo through the endless halls and rooms beyond. Nothing. She knocked again, listening to the boom fade to nothing. Nobody home. What now? She looked around the garden. Should she wait? Come back later? Maybe there was some hidden treasure chest out here. It had to be locked to be behind something, whatever it was. Why else would she need a key? Something as firm and heavy as a stone sunk into her stomach. She pulled the key from her pocket, turning it over in her fingers, the address glinting back at her. The very same address of this mansion. No way. She turned and fitted the key into the door. It fit. The stone doubled in weight. She twisted the key. A click nearly as loud as the boom from the knocker echoed again, and the door creaked open. She screamed and toppled backwards, nearly tumbling down the stairs. This mansion was hers? This was the prize? No, that was impossible. Slowly, ever so slowly, as though expecting the real owners to appear at any second and demand she get off their property, she stepped through the door. The atrium beyond was huge, easily as big as Tina's whole house. It looked gloomy, though. The floor, walls, and ceiling were all a deep mahogany, and dusty lace curtains hung over tiny windows, holding back much of what the little sunlight could get in. And as she stepped inside, she felt paper crunch under her foot. She looked down. A small stack of letters lay scattered on the welcome mat, including one of a golden envelope with the word, "Congratulations, Derby winner," scrawled over it. Tina's knees felt weak. She steadied herself on the nearby wall. So, it was true. This vast place really was hers now. A strange numbness came over her. Unlike the times where she politely refused the chocolate bar, the china set, or the sports car, declaring them as being too much, this truly was too much. Where could she even begin with this place? Even if she moved her parents, grandparents, aunties, and uncles in here, there would still be enough space left in here to lose one another. And even if that did happen, which was unlikely, her family were very happily settled in all corners of the country, Tina would be the first to admit that this place didn't look very homely. She wandered around the halls and rooms for a while. It was a grand old place, as impressive as a museum. But it didn't look comfortable. And it would probably get more difficult to live in as time went by, what with the maintenance and cleaning a house of this size would surely need. How on earth would she be able to afford all of that? All she had were her savings, and that wouldn't last long here. Before she knew it, she'd be stuck in an old lonely mansion on the mountainside. She slumped into a red leather sofa, lost in thought, until she heard a voice coming from the garden. She bolted up. Was that the owner? So maybe this place wasn't hers after all. Her heart thumped. She'd better find a way to sneak out of here before they caught her. She peeked out of the window. A man circled around the garden, talking angrily into his phone. He wore an impeccable suit, which was more than could be said for the obviously fake wig on his head. Tina squinted through the window. Could it be? Yes, it was. It was the guy who had bought the house on the hill. But what was he doing here? Had he bought this house somehow? But that would be impossible, she told herself. She'd won this place as a prize. Perhaps... A miraculous idea formed in her head. An irresistible smile spread across her face. Maybe, just maybe. She raced down the stairs, each step creaking in protest, and stepped back out into the chill air of the evening. Wigman was still bellowing into his phone, his wig trembling atop his head. "What do you mean, not for sale?" he growled. Everything's for sale, Tim. Could you at least get the contact of the new owner? What? A prize? Well, what difference does that make? Get on the phone to the organizer of that race and... Wigman caught Tina's eye. For a second, they held each other's gaze in silence. I'll call you back, said Wigman, and he pocketed his phone. He looked at Tina squarely now. Fancy seeing you here. I was about to say the same thing, said Tina, leaning against the door. Wigman looked up at the mansion. It's a nice place, this. Why, thank you, said Tina. I'm thinking of giving it a makeover, though. Painting walls mustard yellow, building a deck out here. You're the expert. What do you think? The colour drained from Wigman's face. Tina had to suppress a laugh. His wig quivered atop his head like some frightened animal. So, it looks like you got your house on the mountain after all, eh, dearie? He said, trying to sound cool, but dabbling a handkerchief on his sweating forehead. Yep, said Tina brightly, crossing her arms, and I have you to thank for it. Wigman frowned. Then his face fell. He looked suddenly tired, as though he'd aged 10 years before Tina's eyes. Okay, I get it, he said, throwing his hands up to the air. You got me. Very shrewd of you, I must say, dearie. You should consider working on the property ladder. Tina shrugged. Perhaps I will. I feel like I've got a good head start with this place, wouldn't you say? Wigman puffed out his cheeks. Tina had to admit she was having fun making him squirm. It was worth having the mansion just for the look on his face. Wigman took a checkbook and a pen from his pocket. Very well, he said. Name your price. It's not for sale. Wigman nearly dropped his pen. He glared at her. Everyone has her price, dearie. Not me, she said, taking the key from her pocket and twirling it around her fingers. But I can be convinced in a trade. Tina stepped into the house on the hill, heart drumming on her ribs. The smell of pine on a fresh breeze rushed up her nose, and she took in the surroundings. Like the mansion on the mountain, it too was bare, the moonlight bouncing off of the bare floorboards. But unlike that huge labyrinth of rooms, this was just the right size. With chairs, tables, pictures and trinkets, it truly will be hers. She walked up the stairs and looked out of the bedroom window. The town glittered below, overlooked by the rising crescent moon. Having traded the house instead of buying it, she still had all of her savings. She could fill the house with all of the best furniture. And yet, that would fill the house, but it wouldn't fill the home. She'd completed her one and only goal in life today. What was next? A breeze fluttered across the hill, the grass swaying like a wave. What next? That question had scared her before, made her feel hollow and shallow. But now it excited her. She knew what to do. She turned and rushed down the stairs. She stepped out of the front door and into the night, running down the hill. She stopped to pull a single blade of straw and then rushed into town. The end.